psychologist, and I'm all the way across the US over here on the other coast in Santa
Mhm.
Barbara, California. And I am a therapist, but I'm also a mom. I'm a podcaster. I have a podcast called Psychologist Off the Clock. And what I'm really interested in is helping people become more psychologically flexible, more aligned with their values, and really connect with what matters to them and live that out in their daily lives.
Nice. And I really love psychology off the clock because sometimes when you're in this field, people think that you always have it all together. And I know from personal experience, I don't have it all together. So one of the things I want to do is just kind of share with people a little bit about you and how you got to this point. So do you mind telling me a little bit about your background?
Sure. I think I have, when some people ask you about your background as a therapist, it's like, how deep do you go? Right. So, that there's the academic part, which is I've always been interested in actually biology and science. And I was a pre med in college and thought I was going to be a psychiatrist. But then there's the personal part, which was that I really struggled, especially when I was in high school, in college, and I struggled with mental health. I struggled with anxiety and depression and an eating disorder, and it really took me down. And it made me shift my perspective on what I wanted to do with my career, and decided that I wanted to become a therapist because I wanted to help other people figure this stuff out so that they wouldn't struggle in the way that I did, or at least have a path through. And
Oh,
that's what led me to go on
nice.
to get my doctorate. Yeah. Yeah.
So when during the time when you were struggling, were there any aha moments where that turning point took place for you, where it started to make sense?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of them. And actually, a lot of my path to recovery was a spiritual one. So I became really interested in yoga and Buddhism. And I actually went and studied with someone named Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Zen Buddhist monk. He was in France at the time, in exile in France. And that really influenced me in figuring out that all the striving that I was engaging in to try and do more, I always had these goals of like, I need first with the eating disorder, it's like, I need my body to be different. But then it was, I need to be in a relationship, or I need to get certain grades, or I need to get into school, or I need to get a house, or all these different if then whens, I'll be happy. And every time I'd reach one of those places, I would feel dissatisfied. And what Thich Nhat Hanh really taught, what I really learned about there was just the basic practice of being present in the life that you have, and that you can find peace and joy and actually everything that will make you feel content in your life is already here. And that was my first step into some of this mindfulness based practice that then led me to research that when I was in graduate school. And I did a lot of my research in that area.
Wow, that's amazing. I always tell people some of the best books that I read in regards like the self-healing books are by Buddhist authors.
Yeah.
And the way that they think is really like relieves you of the pain that you're in, because a lot of the pain is in our mind and the way that we're framing it. And I know like when I was struggling, it would be hard for me to hear that immediately. So I'm kind of mindful on how I deliver that message to people, because it's a message that in America we don't really talk about much of the hearing now. It's about like the car, the house, the partner, and so we have this mindset that things are happening because we don't have. Did you notice, like when you was doing the practice, did you notice the difference in the way that you grew up versus the way that Buddhism like kind of thinks about things?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of what's interesting is that a lot of the premises that were sort of in this spiritual practice that people have been studying for thousands of years map onto what research is now showing in terms of psychological health, and that a lot of our suffering comes from our struggle and our battle against the present moment, or a battle against our inner experiences, and that our freedom can come from opening up, allowing, or accepting our full experience as a human, which includes things like grief and anxiety and uncertainty. And that when we can learn to kind of drop the rope in that tug of war with ourselves, all of a sudden it's like a big exhale, and it feels like some weights are taken off, and we can live more freely and more fully in our lives. So for me, that meant the exhale of the expectation of what I needed my life to look like. And there was some big pivots that I made in my decision making of like, where do I really want to be to go to school and be with my partner? Or what do I really want to do with my life that actually maps on to what's important to me? And that meant disappointing maybe some people or letting some people expectations down. But ultimately, it freed me up to do what I love, which then just opened up a lot of doors. Yeah.
I love that. And I wanted to add, it's interesting you just said the expectation that people may have had of you, because as we're changing, sometimes the people in our lives may no longer fit in our lives because we're kind of going in a different direction. We're not better than them. They're not less than. It's just that we're just different. What would you say to somebody, because you had to pivot and change, some of your environments, and you may have felt like an outsider or different because you're subscribing to a different kind of ideology. What would you
Mhm.
say to people that's kind of in this transitional stage and battling that like transition and feeling like they're leaving people behind? Because that's a real thing I think people have.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the process. And if you think about maybe anything in your life that's been important and meaningful to you, there's been some degree of discomfort associated with it. Like I went bowling with my kids this weekend. I went bowling and I'm very bad at bowling and I don't leave like, oh my gosh, my bowling game. But when I do, when I do something that I care about, like a therapy session and I'm not on my best, and I'm like, I was kind of not the greatest therapist. It'll wake me up in the night, right? Because I care about that. And when you are pursuing things that you care about, it's going to include some discomfort. And that's where ACT can be acceptance and commitment therapy that I practice can be really helpful because it teaches us some skills to open up and allow for that and get clear on the why, what matters to you, what is it in your heart that you really want your life to be about? How do you want to be in this world? And use that as your guide. Because a lot of times what we end up doing is we just make a lot of left turns because we're like turning away from what we don't want to feel. So it's like, oh, I don't want to feel that feeling of breaking up with this friend or breaking up with that, partner or breaking up with that job. So we just don't do it. But that avoidance, you take a lot of left turns and you end up in a circle. And it's a circle of avoidance that just keeps you stuck in your life. In the book, I talk about like a roundabout, like in California. I don't know if you have these in Boston, but in California, they started plopping roundabouts into like congested areas. And
We have them
you
everywhere.
have them. Well, Californians don't know how to drive and they freak out like when you put a roundabout in, we're like, I don't know what to do with this thing. But the thing about a roundabout is that what's hard about it is you have to get off of it, right? And it requires some like moving over a lane and taking that risk to get off. But once you get off, you're free to go wherever you want. You can go on any street in town you want to, right? So we find ourselves in these roundabouts of avoiding discomfort. And some of that avoidance may be like telling this person or making a different choice for myself in my life. But once you do that, it actually can free you up to make the relationships that you do want to have or pursue the career that is a better fit for you.
That's good. And I can't wait to like delve into ACT with my audience. But what is it about the present that is hard for people to lean into? What do you think that is that people struggle with kind of being, because the present is where life is and the moments is where
Yeah.
we can live life and not survive life. I think
Yeah.
we're surviving by worrying about the future or dwelling on the past, but if we can get into the moment, we can actually live life. But why is that hard for people to do that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think, is just our neuroscience, our brains. So evolutionarily, our brains aren't really designed to just be satisfied and like hang out in the present because you need to like, if you think about sort of the evolution of humans, you need to be like going and getting food or running, thinking about who's the next predator that's coming to get you or protecting your space, right? So our brains are actually designed to be somewhat unhelpful in the modern day because we don't need necessarily, it is important to think about those things, but we don't need to be thinking about those things all the time. So that's one thing, is just our brains aren't really designed to be in the present because of our evolutionary neuroscience. But I think another part of it is that we're fed constantly a lot of information and a lot of marketing and a lot of, that we're fed this idea that there is something out there other than right here and now that you need to go strive for or pursue that's better. And there's that sort of FOMO, which is very much part of marketing, that marketing, advertisers market to us to think that you're not okay as you are. That's how you sell beauty products. That's how you sell weight loss products. That's how you sell stuff, right? And so we sort of buy into that because we're fed it. And we're fed it actually even from, I think, a very early on, as children, we're always thinking about the next thing. We're not just allowed to be children enjoying like swinging on a swing. It's like, when are you going to, you know, when are you going to grow up and get to the next, whatever task that you're supposed to achieve?
And even though this is the case, my audience members, we're going to share, or Dr. Hill is going to share with us kind of about ACT and kind of thinking, because I think that once we understand there's this grieving process that takes place, and it gets pretty challenging for people, because we're humans and we're going to feel. And when we start feeling those vulnerable feelings, we have such a negative thought process about it. But if we can accept it as the way we accept happiness or joy, if we can work on accepting and leaning into it, life looks differently. So can you tell me why you decided to create this ACT journal? Because it's a pretty impressive journal where there's journal prompts and so many ways for people to shift their thought process with their personal stories and the things that you get people to do.
Yeah, well, I wrote it with my good friend Debbie Sorensen, and we were good friends first, and then we became podcast co-hosts, and then we wrote this journal. And it was really because we've been practicing this type of therapy for a really long time. Both of us, I've been practicing it for almost 15 years now. And it's something that's really changed my work as a therapist, and that is also being used a lot like in therapy centers and academia and all these places. But a lot of the general public doesn't have access to these ideas and these principles. So we wanted to make something that was usable, that people could apply right here and now in their daily lives. It takes just a few minutes a day, but that could actually help them navigate the difficulties of being human. And it ironically came out right at the time when the pandemic was, sort of shifting. So we were writing this book about psychological flexibility during a time that we needed it for ourselves. We needed to practice self-compassion and self-care and learn how to adapt and change and be flexible and be present and pursue what matters to us. We were writing it during this time, using it in our own lives, and then hoping that it would be helpful for folks, our clients and therapists, and the general public, really, to live more fully.
No, that's good. And it came right on time. And psychological flexibility, can you explain to my audience what that means or what that looks like?
Yeah, it's sort of like, as I age, I notice that parts of my body aren't as flexible as they used to be. I need to work on training them and moving more. I want to move more freely in my body so that I can, age well and be able to continue to be mobile in my life, right? And psychological flexibility is sort of the same thing, but in terms of your mind and your behavior. It involves being able to be open and present. So what we were talking about before, being present to the here and now, and open to your full experience, including the difficult emotions and sensations that are inevitable in life. And then being able to get clear on what matters to you, what's important to you in this moment, and then take action. So if we kind of think about ACT, one of the ways that I've outlined it, I put a post up on my Instagram that's ACT is the acronym. That A would kind of stand for allow and be present. C would stand for care. What is it that you care most about in this moment? And then T would be taking a step. And it can be a tiny step, but any kind of step that's in the direction of what you care about. And that sounds easy, but it's not always so easy. It's not always so easy.
No, it's not. And I try to tell people the reason why it's not so easy is because you're really fighting what you've always known to be true. And, whether it's surviving, some people have always just survived life and never learned how to live. And then they want to start living. And then your body's like, what are we doing? We don't live, we survive. And so even though as me and Dr. Hill is talking about it, in these steps, I appreciate the fact that you're sharing that it's not always as easy, because I think people feel guilty or bad when they're trying to start this work and they find themselves not being able to kind of complete some things. Have you found that to be true in your practice, or as you're sharing with people the guilt or the shame that may come with trying to change their mindset?
Yeah, not only with my clients, but with myself. I also work a lot with therapists. And it's fascinating to be a therapist to a therapist and hear that, like we all struggle. This is, an actor isn't like I'm up here with some like, information that I'm giving to you down here. It's wow, I'm right here alongside you. And I struggle with this every day. That's why I wrote a book on it because I'm trying to figure it out. Right. So, yes. And I think that guilt is sort of, um, it's an interesting thing because we come up against like we're doing the best that we can in the circumstances that we're in, and then we get down on ourselves for not measuring up. And what is actually interesting is that that actually impedes us from being able to do what we care about. So another practice, and actually the very first chapter of the book, that is about self-compassion and self-care and intentional use of time, and it's about breaking that pattern of getting harsh or judgmental with yourself when you're struggling. Because if you think about like a kid that maybe is going to kindergarten, is a little bit scared and having a hard day, if you're harsh or judgmental or mean to that child, is that going to increase or decrease their chances of being able to go out in the world and do that hard thing, right? So it's turning that same kind of the way that you would treat a child or someone that you love when they're struggling or when they're learning something new, starting to do that for yourself. And what the research shows is that actually increases your chance of doing the hard thing and being successful. It increases your performance, actually.
Yeah, that's so true. And then when I think about care, right, because the present piece, I feel like we kind of touched on like the importance of being present, but it's always hard. Tell people a little bit about the importance of care. I think that when I watch how people treat themselves, I realize how they don't really like care or have compassion for themselves, but they have so much for other people. I say you're more than capable of it. I've watched you or seen about how you've been able to do that. But with themselves, people tend to struggle. Why do you think that tends to happen, and what can people do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can develop for a number of different reasons. And some of it is that we learn it from our own caregivers, how either how our caregivers were with themselves or how our caregivers were with us. We learn that's sort of um sometimes we have had harsh early childhoods that can influence then how our own inner voice of how we talk to ourselves. But there's also sort of some societal messaging of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just like push yourself, right? So that's sort of some of the why, but how do we start to shift that is actually starting to notice and really believe in that love and caring is actually something that softens us and actually allows us to be more courageous. So if you can imagine, like, if you're like learning to ride a bike again, the first time you learned how to ride a bike, it's scary. You're most likely going to skin your knee because everyone that rides a bike for the first time is going to fall over. You're going to be wobbly, right? And if you had someone running alongside you was like, I know this is hard. I'm so proud of you. You've got this. Keep going. You might fall. And if you fall, you're going to get up again. I'm going to be right here. And, like, and that holds you if you do fall and then encourages you to get back on. That's the type of inner coach that we need in our lives. And that if we have that for ourselves, then all of a sudden we can do more courageous things. We can step out of our comfort zone. But that's often not the inner coach that we have. We have like someone running alongside us, criticizing us, being judgmental, pointing out every single little move that we did wrong. Right. And everyone has that. I have that. And part of what ACT sort of teaches in that caring is starting to notice the difference between a caring voice and a critical voice. And the critical voice may never go away. It may always be there. Steve Hayes, who's one of the developers of ACT, says that sort of humans are sort of like calculators without delete buttons. We just have add buttons. So we may never be able to delete that critical voice. It may show up, but what we can do is just notice it, get a little space from it, but then turn our actions and our minds and our behaviors towards caring. What are our values? What do I care about most in this moment? And how can I care for myself and others?
Oh, I like that. And I always tell people, because that voice, I always share, personal stories and say, like, even I have that voice. But I also kind of recognize it. And I don't say, like, oh, can you really do that, period. I'll say, like, can you really do that? And now, like, comma, yes, actually, I can do that. And I like speak to it, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about this inner coach, because sometimes people really don't have people in their lives cheering them on. And I say, you've got to
Yeah.
learn to be your kind of biggest cheerleader, and then everyone else is an added bonus. How can people work on kind of being their biggest cheerleader when that voice has been the only voice they've heard for so long?
Yeah. Well, I loved how you said earlier that that people can maybe identify how they spoke to someone else in a caring way. So there's different ways to kind of access that. So one is to think about how you speak to people that you love. What is the languaging? What is the tone? There's even like a tone, right? Like you can imagine your own mind saying your name with a kind tone versus a harsh tone. You can change the tone, even our facial expression and how we hold our bodies, that we can hold our bodies with more of a kind stance, or putting like our hand, like a hand on our heart, or sometimes I'll just put a hand on my belly and be like, hey, I'm here. I got you. That's the same way that you would do that to a child or an animal or a friend, right? Sometimes it's helpful to have, most everyone has had at least some memory where somebody was kind to them. It may have been like that one kindergartner teacher, or it may have been that even just like the guy in Trader Joe's like always seems to be happy in his Hawaiian shirt. Like that one experience of someone that's been kind to you, and taking in that experience of compassion and kindness and friendliness, and then cultivating that towards ourselves. But it's something that we can learn, and that it takes practice, and it takes awareness, and it actually takes that mindfulness. It takes being present to just notice the automaticity of the self judger and the critiquer is the first start. And then you notice that, you get a little space from it, and then maybe you can start to cultivate another voice in there, another version of you that's compassionate and cares about you.
Yes, I love that so much. And then when I think about where we're present, we're caring for ourselves, and then we're taking a step. And I know, and I want you to share with people too. Like, this is not like a one-time sit-down thing. I'm always finding myself in this cycle: being present, caring, taking action. Right? It's not. So when you think about taking action, can you talk to people a little bit about why that can be challenging, and how they can work on taking action in their life?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I notice with clients when they come in is that they feel really defeated because they've tried something over and over again. So maybe it's trying to quit smoking, or maybe it's trying to not yell at your kids when you're frustrated, or maybe it's trying to start an exercise program, right? And that happens. Like, well, gosh, I've tried this so many times and I just don't feel like I can't do it, right? I've actually tried to take action multiple times. But oftentimes, why we haven't succeeded at developing some of these changes is there's some like common reasons. Like one is either you made a goal that was a leap. It was too big of a leap. Like maybe it wasn't you need to like walk every day for an hour, but it's walking around the block, at your lunch break. That is the first move to begin to build on that new behavior that you can over time get to an hour, but it's going to take a while, right? Another reason why people struggle with keeping habits in place is they don't set up contexts, like environments, to support them, right? So maybe you're yelling at your kids because you've gotten too hungry, or you're not taking enough breaks for yourself, or you're coming home straight from work and going that transition from like mom to or from work to mom, and there's no like breathing space in there. And so you don't have enough space to actually be successful at this. So looking at what are the contexts that would support me in making the change, that goes back to caring, right? And then the third thing about like making a behavior change or taking that step is that it's a process. And just like learning how to ride the bike, it took a lot of times over and over again. And I actually believe that these are processes that go on forever. There's no endpoint. It's like heading north. You can keep heading north for the rest of your life. You may hit some like goals along the way of like climbing this mountain or crossing that bridge, but really it's a process that will continue forever, and allowing yourself to be in the process of your life. That one of the things that I've been saying a lot is that you're not a work in progress, you are a life in process. And that just means that you're going to continue to unfold forever. So give yourself some grace.
Oh, I love that so much. I'm always talking to people about the grace part, because we are a life in process. When I'm going to start using that, but I'm going to quote you, Dr. Hill. When people are listening to this and they're thinking about this kind of act journal, What would you say you're hoping for people to get? Like, what is your hopes when you were writing this for the ideal person that was reading and utilizing it? Because there's a ton of prompts, a lot of education, which I love. What are your hopes for people?
Yeah, well, the journal is broken down into these 8 weeks. You don't even have to do it in 8 weeks. And I really hope that people are psychologically flexible with themselves in doing it. Like, just pick one week and do a few days. It doesn't have to be done in this order, but it does have this sort of organization. And you go through the core processes that are involved in psychological flexibility. So what those are is you start with self-compassion and with compassion, as I mentioned, and self-care, but then you move into being present. So you spend a week on that and doing journal prompts and learning about the why. And we put in a lot of like science, but we make it really like digestible so that like if you're really into the science, you'll be like, yes, this is evidence-based. But if you don't really care about it, you're like, move on. We tell a story with each one. So you start with being present. And then we also work on cognitive diffusion, which is helping you with your thoughts, doing that sort of getting a little space from your thoughts. You spend a week on acceptance, which is opening up, being willing, allowing for the discomfort of living. You spend a week on your values, which is getting clear about what matters to you in the domains that are important to you in your life. Like, how do you want to be as a therapist? How do you want to be as a daughter or a sister or a friend? How do you want to act? And how do you line up your behavior to match that? And then we also spend a week on perspective taking, which is sort of a different kind of idea in terms of being able to look at your own story that you're stuck in from a different angle or a different view, and then also take perspective from behind other people's eyes and be able to see it's not just about you, like getting out of the ego self-centeredness, but be able to see that this is also about other people's experience. How do you have empathy and perspective for others, and then see that you're connected to a greater whole. And then finally, we spend a week on committed action, which is doing those sort of behavior changes that I was talking about, how to set yourself up for behavior change so that it's effective and successful. Yeah. So that's how it's laid out. And then people can enter in at any place they want along the way. And really the goal is to help people to get unstuck and live more fully and be able to pursue things that matter to them, maybe in places that maybe they've been like in lockdown with their own selves for a while, to get a little
Yeah.
bit more flexibility and freedom in their lives.
Yeah, and one thing about the ACT journal is that it helps shake up some faulty patterns that may be in there. The one thing I wanted you to share a little bit more about is perspective. A lot of times I feel like our ego, we allow our ego to kind of stop us from seeing things or seeing the bigger picture. You know, when I'm working with people and they're struggling like with their parent or, and I'm constantly like not excusing behavior, but just kind of looking at their side and what that may have looked like. Because I think we internalize a lot of things. Can you share people a little bit about that perspective piece that you just shared about?
Yeah, probably giving an example is one of the best ways to look at that. So perspective taking would be a great skill if you're in conflict with someone. So one of the places that I often get into like for whatever reason is when I fight with my partner, it's like in the kitchen. Where it's like end of the day, we're stressed out. That's when we tend to have our fights, right? And it's like after the kids are after dinner and we're like doing the dishes. We're both stressed. And when we're caught in conflict, often the times we're caught in our own story about I'm right and this is my story and this is, what I want to get my point across, right? We don't hear the other person. We can't take their perspective or understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling. So perspective taking would be one, noticing that you're caught in a story and noticing that you're caught in this like small belief system and that you're holding tight to it. And then two, getting a little perspective on that, like, like you said, I think you gave that example of like comma, sometimes or
Yeah,
whatever. Yeah. So
yeah,
like, is that always true? Like there's, some flexibility there, but then also take perspective on the context. Like, why is it that I am so stressed right now or so rigid right now? There's things that are influencing me. It may have been what happened earlier in the day. It may be that I'm tired and I didn't sleep well last night, or I have a big day tomorrow. And then getting behind the eyes of the other person and realize that they have that too. They are in their story. They have their own context, right? That is influencing how they're acting. And also, they have their own vulnerability that they're protecting just like you. And it's oftentimes being able to tap into that vulnerability that then can help you kind of drop the wall and the fighting and be able to connect on a deeper level. But that's how something like perspective taking can be really helpful, get us unstuck from a place when we're just kind of heading in a direction we don't want to be heading.
I love the fact that Dr. Hill used partner, because I think this is the hardest area that I had to practice it, because I was so caught up in my story, and a lot of my childhood trauma and lens played a role in the way that I viewed things in the relationship. And not only like my healing process and my self-awareness like helped me a lot, but even though I was still doing well, when you're in a relationship, it makes it even more challenging. So I really had to like, and the way Dr. Hill explained it is, we already said this earlier, but it's not that simple, because especially when your emotions are all over the place, you take a step back. I take a step back. And the beauty about it, because it's not that I can stop these vulnerable emotions or triggers from happening. The beautiful thing about doing what Dr. Hill just talked about is that you don't feel like you're not in control. Like you don't, for a longevity, like, you're not going days in this kind of feeling of pain. You're able to acknowledge and working it through, processing it. Like, I feel like I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm like, this is a disaster. This isn't going to get better. I think that's the really like amazing thing about having perspective, where in a lot of times this is utilized like with conflict, I think, for people. Would you say that's fair to say, like the beauty of it?
Yeah, I think it's helpful with conflict. I think it's helpful when we're stuck in like anxiety and like when you're in
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, it kind of narrows in and you look at things in a very small, kind of like
Yeah.
close up threat mind way. Being able to even just shift your eyes to look at the horizon, like literally take perspective, like look at the horizon, look outside, look at something that's far away and bigger, because a lot of times when we're in anxiety or we're in fear, or even when we're in like caught in rumination, it's all so like narrow.
Yeah.
It's all so egocentric and narrow. And we need to expand our awareness that can really
Yes.
help us. So taking perspective, getting flexible and having lots of views in, even taking perspective on our own lives, like remembering, wait a minute, there's a whole timeline of my life and there's periods of my life where I've had a hard time before. And what did I
Mm-hmm.
learn from that hard time? How did I grow? I'm really interested in this concept of post-traumatic growth, right? That we can actually grow from our trauma. And what's interesting about post-traumatic growth is that it's different from resilience. So resilience is your ability to bounce back. But folks that have post-traumatic growth actually got hit hard. They got pummeled in that wave and they grew because they actually got so pummeled by it. And post-traumatic growth has these key ingredients to it of being able to identify some strengths about yourself, being able to identify having deeper, meaningful relationships, having a sense of purpose or spirituality, having a greater perspective. So that can be incredibly helpful when we're caught up in something that's painful, to take perspective on your life. When have I had post-traumatic growth? And how could I use some of those resources right here and right now when I'm stuck?
Dr. Hill, I've never heard of post-traumatic growth. This is
Yeah.
the first time I'm hearing of it. I actually love the way that sounds.
Yeah, it's
Um,
fascinating. Mhm.
okay, thank you for sharing that. So for people that are listening now, this kind of journey we just took, me and Dr. Hill, on with this kind of act journal. It's kind of available everywhere. You can find it. And she has a website where you can kind of get these tools. The fascinating thing about the mind, and as she was talking about earlier, but the mind doesn't really have concept of time. And, we have to work on being mindful and speaking to our mind. So let's say we are doing this journal, any kind of mindful activity that we want to start doing. We have to kind of put some reminders in our phone or in our calendar, because you may listen to this podcast or listen to something that Dr. Hill does, and it may sound very inspiring. And then you go on to the next thing. Remember, she said earlier about all the advertising and all that. So it's easy to forget like the little things that we talk about today. It's little but major when it comes to shifting the way that you think. Are there any tips you give to people for trying to implement new like ways of doing things and incorporating them into their schedule?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, starting small is really important. Making it small and making it doable because our motive, this is from BJ Fogg, who's at Stanford. He talks about our motivation coming in waves. So we tend to take on projects when that wave is high and we're like, our motivation is all, I'm going to like start my exercise program or whatever. But then the motivation is going to go low again. So you want to make it small enough so that when your motivation is low, you'll still be able to do it. And then you want to connect to the why, which is intrinsic, which is deep inside of you. Intrinsic means inside of you, not extrinsic. We're not talking about like giving yourself jelly beans or gold stars, but really what's deep inside of you that matters to you about this. And you remind yourself of that. So I remind myself that when my alarm goes off in the morning, I do a journal practice and a short meditation. I'm talking short. Every morning I try and do that. And my head says, don't get out of bed. But my heart and my gut says this matters to me. And that's what gets me out of bed, not my head. So knowing that your head may not always be the thing you want to listen to, but you inside of you have an inner knowing of why this is important and connecting to that. That's what can motivate you when your motivation is low. So maybe taking a moment just to write down what your motivation is in terms of your deepest values, your deepest caring, and put it in a Post-it note somewhere. And that will be your reminder to engage in that thing. And then creating habits. Habits are really incredibly important. Pretty much everyone has a habit of brushing their teeth. Habits, we can lose that habit. I mean, during COVID, I actually worked with clients that got in the pattern of not brushing their teeth at night because it was like, I'm so depressed. This is so hard. I can't even do this one last thing. But you can get back into your habit. So engage in the habit of, you have your daily habits and start to piggyback, sort of like pancakes, slap on top the new habit that you want to grow on top of an existing habit. So if you already get up in the morning and you make your coffee, then get up in the morning and make your coffee and sit down and do 3 minutes of journaling. And those go together. And then start to do that every day. And then say you want to add on a little bit of meditation or a little bit of movement or a little bit of prayer or whatever it is, you can stack that on too. But start small, connect to your values, and make it a habit.
I love that. You're so amazing. I can tell how passionate you talk about it, like blinking your eye. It's so easy because you really believe in this stuff. Thank you for sharing that. It was really good. If people wanted to do some things with you, they love what you're talking about. I know you have the journal. Is there anything else that you're doing that people can kind of tap into?
Yeah, well, a lot of things. On my website, I have a lot of offerings. So I have meditations and talks that I've given, a lot of different topics. And if you go to drdianahill.com, you'll find that there. If you sign up for my newsletter, you'll get, and that's just through entering into, I think I have ACT body-based practices or ACT for anxiety. If you put your info in there, then you'll get to every couple of weeks, I send out a newsletter of just ideas and tips that I'm thinking about, as well as what I'm doing out in the world. I offer a lot of free stuff. During the pandemic, that was one of my values that I really made a commitment around because my practice got really full. And I started noticing that it got full and then the therapist couldn't find therapists. We were all like, we all need this stuff. And so I really said, you know what, then I gotta give some stuff out so that it's accessible to people. So every Tuesday at 12 o'clock Pacific time, that would be 3 o'clock Eastern time, I do a free talk and a free meditation for folks. That's you can find that on my website. And then I also do workshops a lot in the community that are online. All this is online. And then just my podcast, Psychologist Off the Clock, as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. You're amazing. Is there any last words you want to tell my people?
No, I just really appreciate you hosting this space, and I really think that you're doing incredible work by getting this word out to folks and offering your time. This is all of our time is precious, and then when we spend it together, it makes it extra precious. So I appreciate you for offering your time with me today. I know it's precious.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Well, I appreciate you, and I hope you have a good day.
you too. Take care.
Bye. Okay, so that was Dr. Hill. Amazing stuff. She speaks my language. I love her approach because it's very tangible. I'm so cognitive, and she has a lot of research behind the things that she talks about. So it makes it so that people can not only get educated, but actually start doing. I'm so solution oriented. I love things where people can just like do right now. I think that's important. So make sure you tap into Dr. Diana Hill. .com. Super good stuff. Yeah, she's great. And I think she's near you. You're in California too. So I'll be back on Wednesday live to talk to somebody else that's doing something to empower others. If you want to be a guest on the show, go to CelesteTheTherapist.com. If you want to follow me everywhere at Celeste the Therapist. And until next time, I will talk to you guys later.
Under the 65 days, but I treat every day like it's my last. I'm only concerned with building on the future, cause I can't change my past. Positive vibes for positive lives. She just giving you that truth and shifting your mind. It's more mental than you realize. It's up to you to take control, cause this world is cold and negativity gon' take its toll. Now we've been told any day could be your last. I'm embracing every moment and I cherish every laugh, every smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity. And make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now